I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to do a little video to help non-knitters understand just how long it takes to knit something. I do a lot of knit for hire work, and I lose a lot of people when I give them the price, so I wanted to make this video so that people requesting a quote from me could have an upfront idea of what they're asking for. I'm going to be using worsted weight yarn, which is just a fancy way of saying a standard weight. Most typical sweaters are going to be knit using a yarn of this weight. So obviously, if you're using a thinner yarn, it's going to take longer, and if you're using a thicker yarn, it's going to take less time. This yarn works up to be about 4.5 stitches per inch, so I've cast on 22 stitches, which will be about 5 inches across when I start knitting. I'm going to knit for an hour and then measure the height, multiply that by the width, and see how many square inches I was able to knit in an hour. And then we'll compare that to how many square inches are in your typical sweater and see about how long it takes to knit a whole sweater. So here we go! Okay, so here is my hour's worth of knitting. I measured it and it is 5 inches across and it is exactly 20 inches long, which means that this is 100 square inches of knitting. I could not have asked for a more perfect round number for this experiment. So what does this mean when it comes to knitting something like a sweater? An average medium sweater is 1,600 inches and an average large sweater is 2,200 inches. So you can do the basic math and see that it takes about 16 hours to make a medium sweater and about 22 hours to make a large sweater. If I'm paying myself a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, that means the medium sweater is going to cost about $116 and the large sweater is going to cost about $160. But if I wanted to pay myself a more decent living wage of $10 an hour, then it would be $160 for the medium and $220 for the large. But this was done with me just knitting a simple stockinette stitch. There wasn't any patterning, there wasn't any color work, I didn't have to read a pattern, I was just going back and forth making a rectangle. Knitting a sweater where you have to pay attention to the pattern or to color changes is going to add more time. For example, on this piece I was doing lettering, which required paying attention to a pattern that told me when to shift colors so that I could make the words. That adds time. There's also the process of making a gauge swatch. A gauge swatch is similar to this that I just knit. It's a small piece of knitting that you do for informational purposes and isn't really functional as a piece of knitwear. It's typically about 5 inches by 5 inches, and you use it to measure the stitches per inch and the rows per inch to determine that when you make a full-size sweater, it's actually going to fit the person it's supposed to fit. It's not as important on projects like afghans or plushes where the size doesn't matter as much, but when you're making a sweater, you're probably going to have to do more than one gauge swatch to make sure you're getting the right fit. But then once you're finished with your knitting, your work isn't quite done. You'll notice that on this piece, the ends are curling in on themselves. That's a natural property of this stitch. This is called stockinette stitch, and it's what you see on most of your typical sweaters. In order to keep it from doing this on the final piece, the knitter does what's called blocking, which involves wetting the piece down and then laying it out flat and pinning it in the shape it needs to be. And then when it dries, it lays flat like this. After the sweater pieces are blocked, you have to seam it together, and then you have to weave in the loose ends so that they're hidden and so that the sweater doesn't unravel on you. The finishing process can add another 2 to 5 hours depending on how complex the project is, sometimes even more. And this all assumes that you're using a pre-written pattern. A lot of the projects I do involve working from either a picture or a pre-existing piece, which means that I have to figure out the pattern on my own, which adds additional time to the project. And these are all reasons that requesting a custom hand-knit piece is going to be more expensive than buying a sweater off the rack at the store. Hopefully this video gave you a better understanding of what to expect when you ask for a quote and why it's going to be quoted the way it is. Thanks for watching!